Hello and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is part of my book report series where I share a book that I've read recently that I really enjoyed, that affected me profoundly, and that I therefore want to recommend to others and share some of the thoughts that the book inspired. So today's book is Violeta by Isabel Allende. Isabel Allende is a prolific writer from Chile, though she has lived in exile for many years and actually lives here in Northern California and has lived here for a very long time. And she's probably most famous for her book, The House of Spirits, but she has written numerous books, and including one of my favorites, Eva Luna. And so her latest novel is called Violeta, and Violet, and it tells the story of a woman who was born in 1920 during the Spanish flu and dies in 2020 during the coronavirus pandemic. So born in one pandemic and then dies in another pandemic. And the story is predominantly set in Chile, as most, if not all, of Isabel Allende's books are. And it tells the story of this woman's life, and it's fictional, but it is historical fiction, which is my favorite genre. So you have fictional characters and, fictional events that they go through, but it's set within a true historic context. And so I mentioned, for example, that this book is bookended by two very real historical periods, namely the Spanish flu pandemic of the 1920s and then the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, excuse me. So she lives for 100 years. And this fictional character lives within this true historical context. And then there's many other historical events that happen throughout this fictional character's life that shape this fictional character's life, including World War II, including the Chilean dictatorship, and several others. And so I love historical fiction because you have the fiction part. It's a wonderful story. Just first and foremost, Violeta is a beautifully written book. It's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story about various generations of one family and their trials and tribulations, their highs and lows, their love and their hate, the good and the bad. It's just a beautifully written story about the things that a family goes through and what you can experience throughout the course of your life. And if we are lucky enough, we get to live several lives in the course of our one life. And Violeta, the main character, definitely experiences that. She goes through various phases of her life, doing various things and having different relationships and different visions on her life and different focuses. And I think it was a reminder to me of, again, if we're lucky, life is very long and we get to iterate and be new versions of ourselves and explore different things and adapt and change as we get older. And it's a really fun read to be able to accompany her on this journey and seeing how she evolves and who is born and who dies and how the circumstances around her life influence her view of the world. And Isabel Allende does a very good job, I think, of presenting the character very authentically in all the good and bad, all of the, prejudices that she has, as well as all of the enlightenment that she has, and how that changes with time and age, and understanding that she is a woman of a certain social class and of a certain era, and yet how she is still able to evolve and grow with time. And I think it reminds me of, I think that the character of Violeta also reminded me in that sense of my own grandmother, my mother's mom, who just turned 93, and she lives in Brazil. And, so she has lived a very long life, and I hope that she reaches 100 like this character. And I can see, too, how much she has changed. Of course, I wasn't around when my grandmother was a child or an adolescent, in many years of her adulthood. But I can tell based on conversations with other members of my family and just with my grandma for that sake of just how she has been able to change with the times and how she was born of a certain social class and of a certain time and how that framed her views about things and how she therefore acted accordingly, and how then becoming a mother and raising her own children and how that was its own phase, and then becoming a grandmother and what that brought, and then becoming a great-grandmother and what that brought. And, my grandmother, one of the things I admire so much about her is she has this like eternal juvenile spirit. And I mean that in the best sense of like, she is always, interested in learning more and takes things lightly and, laughs easily and just has this kind of like youthful spirit, like childlike in the sense of like, all right, kids are like always game, to try something new. And even at her age, she understands that the world is changing and that things are, different from how she grew up, but she, wants to learn and, she wants to keep up with the technology and use her smartphone and all this stuff. And I think it's beautiful. And I hope that if I am so lucky, then I can live as chaptered and rich a life as my own grandmother, as well as this fictional character, Violeta. And so that's one of the things I really love about it. It's just a beautiful story. And as I mentioned earlier, with this being historical fiction, I really love that as well because I always learn more about, the world and history in a way that is really fun, right? Because it's within the context of a story. And this book, covered topics that I knew some about, but then it always piques my curiosity to go and to read more about it and, to draw some parallels to current circumstances. So what I mean is that in this book, I mentioned that one of the historical events that this book talks about is the military dictatorship that occurred in Chile. And that lasted from 1973 until 1990. The book also talks about the Argentinian dictatorship because one of the characters ends up living in Argentina for a period of time. And the Argentinian dictatorship lasted from 1976 to 1983. Now, during this time, there was a wave of military dictatorships in Latin America. I mentioned Chile, I mentioned Argentina. It was also the case in Brazil. Brazil had a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985, and there were other countries as well. But for the sake of this episode, I'm going to focus on Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, the Southern Cone. And, this is a part of world history that, like so many parts of world history, at least in the United States, we either don't learn at all or we learn in very limited circumstances. I remember that I learned about this in college in a Latin American Studies course that I was taking. So it was something that I had self-selected into rather than it being part of general historical classes. And we particularly don't learn about how prominent the United States' role was in supporting and perpetuating these dictatorships. Now, during this time, this is when the Cold War was going on. And the United States used the threat, the fear of communism as its public excuse to overthrow governments in many countries and to install really right-wing governments who often were dictatorships and which were very brutal against their own people. And the United States did this to protect economic interests in those countries. In Chile, for example, Chile had democratically elected a president, a guy named Salvador Allende, and he had begun to nationalize some of the industries in the country, meaning that they became government-owned rather than privately owned. There were also certain land reforms and other progressive policies that he implemented during his short time in power. And the United States didn't like this, as well as certain groups within Chile. The United States didn't like this because capitalism, because they wanted to be able to have, it's more than capitalism. It's the United States wanting to be able to have corporate control over natural resources in Chile. And so with the assistance of the United States, Salvador Allende was pushed out of office. There was a military coup, and this dictator named Augusto Pinochet became the ruler of Chile. And then, as I mentioned before, from 1973 to 1990, he presided over the country during many years of massive oppression. Many people were disappeared, many people were killed, many people were tortured, many people were exiled, including, this is something that Isabel Allende, the author, and her family, this is something that they experienced. So I encourage people to read more about her own personal story. Again, bits and pieces of get woven into many of her books, including Violeta. And while this is going on in Chile, something similar is going on, as I mentioned, in Argentina and Brazil, with the U.S.'s support. You have democratic leadership that is then pushed out, military dictatorship installed, with the support of the United States in order to maintain access to resources in those countries, all under the guise of fighting communism. That's how it was sold to the public. And U.S. support came in the form of not only financial, but also in terms of military support, military training, tactical support, espionage, and things like that. And one of the physical embodiments of that U.S. role is a military training academy known as the School of the Americas. You may have heard of the School of the Americas. It's very infamous. It's a military training ground in Georgia that the United States has used to train a whole host of shady actors in the Americas, in Central and South America, that have then been part of military dictatorships, oppressing people, killing people, disappearing people, torturing people, and all kinds of extremely shady practices, probably many amounting to war crimes, and they're all and many of them were trained at the School of the Americas, which is now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, but it still does the same thing. So the School of the Americas, it's a U.S. military training camp that's run by the Department of Defense. It's located in Columbus, Georgia, and this school played a prominent role in training many of the military actors who were involved in these dictatorships in the southern cone of Latin America. And when I was looking up some additional information about each of these dictatorships, I wanted to read something that I found from the website. It's actually a George Washington University website that is the NSA National Security Archive information. So information that has been released through Freedom of Information Act requests and hosted at nsaarchive.gwu.edu. Again, that's NSA archive, so just one A, .gw.edu. Anyway, one of the articles talks about the U.S. involvement in the Argentinian dictatorship. It was known as the Dirty War, La Guerra Sucia. And I want to read one of the paragraphs that this article discusses because I think it encapsulates very well what the general view of the U.S. government was at this time and how the U.S. was trying to preserve its interests while trying to sell to the public that the basis for this was like trying to, prevent the spread of communism, when really it was about economic interests and global dominance, and resulted in massive human rights violations, war crimes, and decades of oppression, torture, disappearances, exile of people who dared to stand in the way of dictatorship, and meant that democracy was not in effect for many decades in these countries, and that some of them are quite nascent, right, in their democratic development, because the United States participated in overthrowing democratically elected leaders. So I want to read this one paragraph that is a reflection. It's a quote from a report that then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger wrote. And Henry Kissinger is an infamous character. He has so much blood on his hands from so many conflicts around the world that the U.S. Was involved in perpetrating. Again, I'm just highlighting a few, but so many others, El Salvador and many others during this time. Anyway, I'm just going to read the paragraph. In the first substantive report to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger on a, quote, possible coup in Argentina, close quote, in mid-February 1976, Assistant Secretary of State William Rogers flagged the likelihood of human rights violations after a military takeover. Quote, we would expect the military government to be friendly toward the United States, close quote, he apprised Kissinger. Quote, however, in stepping up the fight against the guerrillas, an Argentine military government would be almost certain to engage in human rights violations such as to engender international criticism. This could lead to U.S. public and congressional pressures, which would complicate our relations with the new regime, close quote. Anticipating problems with the United States over the repression against subversion they would implement, the Argentine, quote, military planning group, close quote, approached officials in their own foreign ministry to advise, quote, as to how the future military government can avoid or minimize the sort of problems the Chilean and Uruguayan governments were having with the U.S. over the human rights issue, close quote. So, the United States knew that by supporting dictatorships, human rights violations were going to happen. And their only concern about the human rights violations were not actually the violations themselves, but the criticism that it would generate, which would complicate their ability to cooperate with the dictatorships, to maintain U.S. hegemony in the area, to maintain U.S. monopolies over access to resources through private corporations, through American military access. And so I just thought that this paragraph just summarized that lens so well. And it's really sad to see that we have continued to see that double standard in terms of like what the actual motive is versus what is sold to the public happen over and over again. We saw that, for example, with the war in Iraq, right? The United States, President Bush was like, weapons of mass destruction, we've got to do this. This is so important. And that was all a lie. And it was all about access to oil. We are seeing the United States to this day continuing to fund oppressive regimes like Israel's campaign of genocide against Gaza and Palestinians, and this same kind of tension between the U.S. knowing that Israel is committing human rights violations and it is receiving international criticism for that, And yet it's still, for military and economic and other strategic reasons, is still backing Israel in this situation. So I just wanted to mention that, and the context of what was happening at the historical time, and the US's involvement in that. And the book doesn't go into that level of detail, and at the same time goes into far more detail because it's told from, a first-person perspective of people that were going through it and what they experienced and who was targeted. And parts of the book take place in the United States, and so it talks about that and the various ways that people navigated that time period. And if you're interested in learning more about those those historic events, there's a couple of films I can recommend. One about the Chilean dictatorship. It's a movie called Machuca, which is one of the classics. So if you want to learn more about the Chilean dictatorship, Machuca is one of the classics. Regarding the Argentinian dictatorship, there is a movie called La Historia Oficial, the official story, La Historia Oficial. And it's one of the classic films as well. Both of these films are fictional, Machuca in Chile and La Historia Oficial in Argentina. But again, they are set during the dictatorships, and so they have real historical context around them. And the Machuca centers around the friendship and the relationship between two young boys who are going to school in Santiago when the dictatorship happens, when the military coup happens, and they're from different social classes and what transpires as a result. La Historia Oficial talks about one of the aspects of the Argentinian dictatorship, which is about illegal adoptions. Women who were targeted by the government for whatever reason and were either imprisoned or killed or both, who gave birth during that time, their children were, in many cases, illegally stolen, were taken from them by the government, and they were adopted by upper-class families, some knowingly and some not. And this movie, La Historia Oficial, the official story, talks about one of those instances. So I wanted to mention a few of those. And, there was also, one other aspect of this, if you're interested in looking into this more, there was also a name for this coordination of propping up dictatorial regimes in Latin America in the name of fighting communism, but really it was all about economic interests and monopoly for the sake of the U.S. And the name of this coordinated operation that the U.S. was involved in was called Operation Condor. And the idea was, we got to get rid of all the leftists, and we're going to get rid of them through the use of kidnapping and torture and disappearances and killings and all kinds of other stuff. And the School of the Americas that I mentioned earlier trained many of the operatives who implemented Operation Condor throughout the Americas in the 1970s and 80s. So, yeah, not good. And to bring it to the present day, once more, the current presidential campaign makes me think about this as well, because, what always happens in a dictatorship is that people that are considered problematic, quote unquote, problematic for the regime are taken out. And people that are considered problematic is a very broad category of anyone who either dares to speak out against the oppression or simply because of their existence as seen as contrary, right, to the vision of that dictatorship. And these right-wing dictatorships all kind of follow along the same lines of, very conservative, very Christian nationalist traditional patriarchal systems. And so people like journalists and intellectuals and artists and professors and queer people and women who are considered too outspoken and disabled people and anyone else that the regime considers to be problematic, those are the first people that get taken out. Those are the ones that are disappeared. They are killed. Many of them go into live into exile if they are fortunate enough to escape. And this is, a repeat pattern with any of these dictatorial regimes. Those tend to be the group of people, student activists that tend to be targeted first. And I can't help but think about, Trump running for president and Project 2025 and the very real possibility that if Trump wins, we know that he's going to be a dictator. He has said that he is going to be that, that's what's going to happen. And as dictator, that's what's going to happen. People are going to be disappeared. People are going to be killed. People are going to be tortured. People will be forced into exile. And it's going to be the same types of people: journalists, intellectuals, artists, professors, queer people, women considered too outspoken. Definitely anyone that Trump considers his political enemy, because he's constantly talking about them, locking up his political enemies and talking about violence against them and things like that. And as further evidence of how that dictatorial, checklist is part of Trump's plan as well, I want to talk about Project 2025 briefly, which is the blueprint for his second term, or the rest of his term, because he's not going to leave in 4 years if he wins. There was a recent article that came out about one of the architects of Project 2025, a man named Russ Vought. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. I think it's Russ Vought is how you pronounce it. Anyway, he was recently interviewed and he talked about how part of the Project 2025 plan is to use the military to silence political dissent, right? That's dictatorship 101 right there. And I want to quote from him. Again, this is an architect of Project 2025, which is the blueprint for another Trump administration. And one of the architects of it, I want to quote from this recent interview that he did about this tactic of using the military to silence political dissent. So, quote, and he's making reference to the protests that broke out throughout the United States in 2020 following police murdering George Floyd. And if you recall, there were protests in D.C. and Trump wanted to stick the military onto those protesters. All right, so this Project 2025 architect says, quote, George Floyd was obviously not about race. It was about destabilizing the Trump administration. We put out, for instance, a 50-page paper designed for lawyers to know that the president has, the ability to both, along the border and elsewhere, to maintain law and order with the military. And that's something that is going to be important for him to remember and his lawyers to affirm. Close quote. So, yeah. I'm feeling very hopeful about November, and I talked about that more in depth in a previous episode. So I don't think that Trump is going to win in November. But I think that it's important to be able to draw these parallels because I think that Americans in general, certain groups more than others, can be a bit idealistic about the types of risks that we face. There's no reason that the United States is going to be immune to the risk of dictatorship. The United States had segregation until, 50 years ago. The United States has not been an actual democracy for most of its existence. The United States has had slavery for hundreds of years. We've done very shady stuff. And so the idea that oh, this is stuff that happens in other countries, this could never happen here, I don't think is a prudent perspective. I think we need to study history and we need to see what has happened around the world, particularly when the US has been involved in that destabilization of democratic regimes around the world, to advance its own interests, and to, be cautious and wary about that happening here, and to fight against that, and to realize that, it is about a democracy if we can keep it, to kind of change that famous quote. And so, those are just things that this book, Violeta, made me think about, within a gorgeous story about a family and the various generations of this family, and just a really engrossing read. I was also reminded of, these broader historical contexts and the parallels to the modern moment. And I really love that the book is able to make that social commentary without it without it being so, what's the right word? It's not coming to me, but it's not trying to hit you over the head with this information and to make you feel bad about it, and to be very I know someone listening to this knows the right word. Then you can text me it. But it presents a lot of social commentary in a digestible way, a non-alienating way, in an inviting way, from the perspective of someone living it, that I can't help but to draw parallels to what has happened elsewhere and to what is happening in the current moment. And I think it's wise of us to be able to draw these parallels. Because remember too, this is not ancient history. This is so recent. Many people listening to this were alive during these times, I mean, the Chilean dictatorship didn't end until 1990. The Brazilian military dictatorship didn't end until 1985. This is so recent. And so this is living memory. This is living history, and ties to what is currently being cooked up by the Trump campaign and Project 2025. And our responsibility, to not do this anymore around the world, even though seems like the United States continues to do so, and to educate ourselves about it so that we can be informed voters and understand the fragility of democracies and the importance of us fighting for it. And because at least for me, that's the world I want to live in. I'm not interested in a military dictatorship. No thanks. So anyway, on that note, I highly recommend Violeta by Isabel Allende. She's such a fantastic writer. So many of her books are wonderful. I haven't read them all, but the ones I have, I really enjoy. And I find it so impressive that after decades of writing, she is still able to produce work of such fantastic quality. And, in recognition of that, I was reading on the book jacket cover that in 2018, she was the first author of the Spanish language. So she writes in Spanish. So the first author in Spanish who was awarded the National Book Award in the United States. And so, that's huge. And she has, accumulated tons of awards around the world. So recognitions are well-deserved, excellent read. And if you do end up reading the book yourself, please reach out to me. I'd love to know your thoughts about the book. And happy reading. All right. So on that note, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.